A black woman, Mia, was walking home late after a long shift. The streets were nearly empty, the moon hanging high above her, casting long shadows. As she passed a dark alley, a white man, clearly intoxicated, stumbled towards her. He leered at her, muttering offensive words under his breath. Mia kept her head down, ignoring him, but his words became louder, more aggressive. "Why don't you go back where you came from?" he sneered. "People like you don't belong here." Mia's pulse quickened, but she refused to engage. She'd faced this kind of hostility before. Her shoes clicked against the pavement, steady and rhythmic. She knew she had to stay calm, keep walking, keep her distance. But the man was not finished. He blocked her path, his breath reeking of alcohol, his eyes glazed with rage. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat, taking a step closer. "I should teach you a lesson." Before Mia could react, his hand shot out and slapped her across the face. The force of the blow sent her head snapping to the side. A sharp pain throbbed in her cheek, but she stood tall, refusing to show weakness. The world seemed to slow down around her, the blood rushing in her ears. The man laughed, a twisted, cruel sound. "What's the matter? You gonna cry now?" For a moment, Mia did nothing. She didn't speak, didn't move. She simply stood there, staring him down. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, as if she were drawing in the strength of something greater than herself. In that stillness, an overwhelming sensation flooded through her, a sense of power, of something ancient, something she had never felt before. It started as a whisper in her mind, a memory, a connection to something long lost. In the blink of an eye, the sensation became reality. A flash of light radiated from within her, surrounding her like a shield. Her body felt different, stronger, more capable, as if she were channeling the essence of countless ancestors. Her hands, trembling with new energy, reached out. Before the man could comprehend what was happening, she grabbed his wrist with a force he couldn't escape. His eyes widened in fear, the surprise evident in his face. He tried to pull away, but it was useless. She was no longer just a woman, she was a conduit of the past, of the spirits of those who had been wronged, who had fought, who had died. What are you?" he stammered, his voice breaking. His bravado shattered, replaced by terror. "You've woken something you can't control," Mia replied, her voice steady but filled with authority. It was not just her speaking, it was the voices of her ancestors, those who had been denied justice, who had suffered because of men like him. Her grip tightened, and suddenly the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with energy. The man recoiled, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape, but the shadows seemed to close in around him. He stumbled backward, only to be caught by an unseen force. Mia stepped forward, her body now radiating a soft glow, her eyes sharp and focused. The man's arrogance had vanished, replaced by raw, uncontrollable fear. "You can't hurt me anymore," Mia said quietly, her words carrying the weight of generations. The pain in her cheek still throbbed, but it no longer mattered. She felt the presence of those who had come before her, their strength, their courage, their determination to survive. They were with her, and they were demanding justice. The man's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his chest as if he were struggling to breathe. The air around him seemed thick with pressure, heavy with the weight of his wrongdoings. The spirits of Mia's ancestors surrounded him, their whispers audible only to him, telling him of the suffering he had caused, of the lives he had taken, of the hate he had spread. "You will not escape the consequences of your actions," Mia continued, her voice now echoing with a power beyond comprehension. The man gasped, his eyes bulging with fear, his hands scrambling at the air in a futile attempt to break free. But Mia was resolute. She knew she could not undo the damage he had caused. But she could stop him from hurting anyone else. The energy swirling around her intensified, and the spirits guided her, urging her to act. She held out her hand, and the man, unable to resist, was lifted into the air, his body trembling with terror. "You will never forget this night," Mia said, her voice cold, final. "You will never forget the power of those you tried to destroy." With that, she released him, dropping him to the ground with a harsh thud. The energy around her dissipated, and the glow faded. The alley was silent again, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. The man lay there, gasping for air, his face pale, his entire body trembling. He was no longer the predator, no longer the aggressor. He was a broken man, defeated by the very force he had sought to harm. As Mia turned and walked away, she knew this was just the beginning. The curse had awakened, yes, but it was not a curse, it was a calling. And she would answer it, for her ancestors, for her community, for herself. Mia walked away, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The encounter with the man had been a shock, but there was something deeper that unsettled her, something ancient, something that had stirred within her when he laid his hands on her. She felt a connection to her past, to her bloodline, a force that was both foreign and familiar, coursing through her veins. It wasn't just the adrenaline from the confrontation, it was the power of her ancestors, awakening in response to his violence. As she moved through the streets, the weight of the experience began to sink in. The man's words still echoed in her ears, each one a reminder of the hate and prejudice that had fueled centuries of oppression. But now, that oppression had become more than a shadow, it had become a call to action. She could feel the spirits of her ancestors, their voices a constant hum in her mind. They were here, with her, guiding her. She was not alone in this fight. She returned home, her steps heavy with the realization that her life would never be the same. She didn't know how to explain what had happened or what this new power meant for her future, but she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility. Her ancestors had fought for survival, for justice, and for equality. Now, it was her turn to carry that legacy forward. As she sat down in her small apartment, the spirits grew louder, their voices melding into one unified message. The man had been a symptom of a larger problem, a festering wound that had infected not just him, but the entire community. His racism was just one face of a system built on hatred, built on the belief that some people were worth more than others. And as long as that belief continued to thrive, people like Mia, and her ancestors, would remain in the shadows. But Mia was no longer afraid of the shadows. She could feel her ancestors' strength building within her, like a fire that had been smoldering for years, waiting to be lit. They had fought for justice in their own time, and now it was her turn to do the same. The power she had felt when she confronted the man was not just a defense mechanism, it was a call to arms. The voices in her mind grew clearer. They spoke of the history of violence, of the countless injustices that had been done to their people. They spoke of the pain of ancestors who had been beaten, enslaved, and murdered. But they also spoke of the resilience that had been passed down through the generations. That resilience, that strength, was now hers to wield. Mia took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew that the man she had encountered was only a small part of the problem. His actions were a reflection of a larger system, one that would not be dismantled by a single confrontation. But that didn't mean she had to stand idly by. She had the power to fight back, to challenge the forces of hate and injustice. She had the power to make a difference. As the days passed, Mia began to test the limits of her new abilities. At first, it was small things, shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, whispers that guided her steps, the occasional flicker of light that told her when she was being watched. But as she focused, she began to tap into something deeper. Her connection to her ancestors grew stronger, and with it, her power. She could feel the spirits as though they were standing right beside her, their presence an ever-present force that guided her every move. The more she embraced her abilities, the more she realized how vast her ancestors' influence was. They weren't just ordinary spirits, they were warriors, leaders, activists. They had fought for change in their time, and their legacies lived on through her. They were teaching her, showing her how to use her power to protect not just herself, but the community that had been built on the sacrifices of those who came before her. One evening, as she walked through her neighborhood, she saw something that made her blood boil. A group of men, white men, were standing outside a convenience store, hurling racial slurs at a black family walking by. The woman, her young children in tow, kept her head down, trying to ignore the taunts. But Mia couldn't ignore it. She had felt the power of her ancestors awaken within her, and now it was time to use it. Without thinking, she walked toward the group of men. They didn't notice her at first, too busy with their taunts, too caught up in their own sense of superiority. But when she stepped into their line of sight, they immediately stopped. They looked at her, sizing her up with suspicion and disdain. "What do you want, freak?" one of them sneered. "You got a problem?" Mia didn't flinch. She stood tall, her stance steady and unwavering. She could feel the spirits of her ancestors behind her, their energy swirling around her like a protective shield. "I want you to leave them alone," Mia said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "This ends now." The men laughed, dismissing her as another victim to push around. But Mia wasn't just any victim. She was a force of nature, a descendant of those who had fought back against oppression. The power that surged within her was undeniable. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift as if it were alive, and the men looked around, confused. Suddenly, the air grew thick, heavy with the presence of the spirits. The men's faces drained of color as they felt the weight of the history Mia represented. The shadows around them seemed to close in, and the whispers of Mia's ancestors filled their ears. They heard stories of black families torn apart by violence, of lives lost in the fight for equality, of the strength that had been passed down through generations. "Leave them alone," Mia repeated, her voice rising with power. "Your hate has no place here." The men staggered back, their bravado faltering. One by one, they turned and walked away, their heads low, their spirits crushed by the weight of what they had just experienced. As they disappeared into the night, Mia took a deep breath, letting the power within her settle. The spirits were still with her, their energy now calm, as if they were pleased with her actions. She knew that this was only the beginning. She had a responsibility now, to her ancestors and to her community. She had the power to fight back, to make a change. And she would use it, no matter what. Her ancestors had fought for justice, for equality, for dignity. And now Mia would continue that fight. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was ready. The curse had not just awakened her powers, it had awakened her purpose. And she would see it through to the end. Mia had always known that her community was a place of resilience. It had weathered countless storms, discrimination, violence, and injustice, yet it had always fought back, always found a way to stand tall. But after that night, after she had embraced her ancestral power, she saw her community through new eyes. The people she had grown up with, the people she had always known, were more than just survivors. They were warriors in their own right. And now, she was one of them. The following days were filled with both clarity and confusion. Mia could no longer ignore the responsibility that came with the power she had unlocked. She began to hear the whispers of her ancestors more frequently, their voices guiding her, pushing her toward action. It wasn't just about protecting herself anymore. It was about standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. It was about changing the world, starting with her own neighborhood. At first, she didn't know where to begin. The injustices were everywhere, lurking in every corner of the city. But as she walked through the streets, she started to see the patterns. The way people of color were treated differently, the way they were silenced, the way their voices were often ignored. And she knew that if she wanted to make a real difference, she had to confront these issues head-on. Her first real opportunity came when she overheard a conversation in the local diner. Two white men were sitting at a table near the window, speaking loudly about a recent incident in the city. Mia had been listening to the news when their voices caught her attention. "They're just taking what's ours," one of them said, his tone thick with bitterness. "These people, they think they can just come in here and take everything. I'm tired of it." His companion nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, I'm tired of them always demanding respect. They don't deserve it." Mia's blood ran cold. She had heard enough. The man's words were filled with a kind of hatred that reminded her of the man she had confronted on the street. It was the same kind of racism that had been passed down for generations, a hatred that had been allowed to fester unchecked. But this time, Mia wasn't going to stay silent. She stood up, her legs shaking with both fear and resolve. Her ancestors were with her, urging her forward. With each step, she felt their presence more strongly, the power they had given her ready to be unleashed. She approached the table, her eyes locked onto the two men. They looked up, their expressions shifting from casual indifference to surprise. The room seemed to quiet around her, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. "What's the problem?" Mia asked, her voice calm but edged with authority. Her words seemed to hang in the air, thick with the energy of generations past. The men blinked, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. The first one scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Who the hell do you think you are, coming over here and interrupting?" Mia's gaze didn't waver. "I'm someone who's had enough of people like you spreading hate," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "You think it's okay to treat others like they're less than you? You think it's okay to spew lies and venom?" The second man sneered, but Mia could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know what to make of her, didn't understand the power that radiated from her. The first man, however, leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "You better watch your mouth, girl," he warned, his voice thick with venom. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Mia didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her eyes burning with the intensity of her ancestors' fury. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said, her voice now echoing with a depth that startled even her. "I'm dealing with ignorance and fear. And that ends today." For a brief moment, there was a heavy silence. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them made a move. The air around them seemed charged, filled with the weight of history, of the struggles Mia's ancestors had faced. The spirits that had been with her since the night of the confrontation now surged forward, their presence undeniable. "You have no right to spread hate," Mia continued, her words now cutting through the tension like a knife. "You have no right to belittle those who are different from you. And if you don't stop, I'll make sure you understand just how powerful the people you've wronged really are." The first man's face twisted with anger, but he remained silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The second man, however, couldn't hide his fear. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around as though searching for a way out. Mia wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let them walk away without facing the consequences of their actions. The spirits of her ancestors surrounded her, their energy palpable in the room. She could feel them, urging her to act, to take control of the situation, and show these men what true power looked like. With a swift motion, she raised her hand, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The men looked at her, their faces going pale as they realized that she wasn't just some ordinary woman. The air around them began to shift, crackling with the energy of Mia's ancestors. The first man began to sweat, his hand trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "You can't scare me," he growled, but his voice trembled with uncertainty. Mia's eyes narrowed. "It's not fear you should be feeling," she said, her voice now a steady whisper. "It's accountability." With that, the energy in the room seemed to snap. The men's bodies stiffened, as though something invisible was holding them in place. They could no longer move, no longer speak. Mia had not only confronted them with her words, but with the power of her lineage. The spirits of her ancestors had surrounded them, their voices filling the room, reminding the men of the pain they had caused, the lives they had destroyed with their hate. The first man, now unable to move, let out a strangled gasp. His eyes widened as he looked at Mia, his defiance crumbling away. The second man's eyes were filled with terror, his breast shallow and panicked. Mia stood before them, her posture unyielding, her presence commanding. "You will remember this," she said softly. "You will understand the weight of your words, of your actions. The power you thought you could wield against others will be returned to you tenfold." The men collapsed in on themselves, their shoulders hunched, their spirits broken. They were no longer the ones in control. They were the ones who had been judged, and the spirits of Mia's ancestors had spoken. As the room returned to silence, Mia felt the power within her dissipate. The energy of her ancestors settled back into her, leaving her with a deep sense of purpose. The men, now freed from the hold of her power, stood up, their eyes downcast, their bodies trembling with the realization that they had been defeated not just by Mia, but by the generations of those they had oppressed. They stumbled out of the diner, not daring to look back. Mia's ancestors, their spirits still with her, had delivered the justice that was long overdue. Mia stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling with each steady breath. She had made her stand. But the journey was far from over. She knew that she could not change the world overnight. But she also knew that with her ancestors at her side, nothing could stand in her way. The fight for justice, for equality, was just beginning. And she would lead it, with the strength of her lineage guiding her every step of the way. Mia had become a symbol, but she hadn't anticipated the weight of the expectations others would place on her. Every time she stepped out into the streets, she felt the eyes of her community upon her. They watched her as though she were some kind of savior, some kind of hero. They no longer saw her as just Mia, they saw the embodiment of something greater. The spirits of her ancestors had chosen her for a reason, and now the entire neighborhood seemed to believe she held the key to their collective future. It was overwhelming, and at times, Mia questioned her own abilities. She was still learning to control the powers she had been given. The voices of her ancestors were always there, but their guidance was cryptic, often leaving her to interpret their wisdom on her own. At first, it had been as though the weight of their presence was a blessing. But now, it felt like a burden. How was she supposed to lead when she didn't even fully understand the extent of the power within her? One afternoon, as Mia sat in her living room, trying to meditate and focus, the voices of her ancestors spoke to her once again. They came in waves, at first soft whispers, then growing louder, filling her mind with ancient knowledge and wisdom. It was clear that they were pushing her to take more action. They were asking her to step up, to take responsibility for the community's well-being, and to lead the charge in a way that would leave a lasting impact. They wanted her to dismantle the systems of oppression, to fight against the very structures that had held her people down for centuries. But the challenge seemed impossible. There were those who resisted change at every corner, who preferred to maintain the status quo because it served their interests. Mia had seen it in the way businesses operated, in the way the police enforced laws, and in the way her people were treated by those in power. It wasn't enough to confront individuals anymore, it was time to confront the system. That realization weighed heavily on her. She couldn't do it alone, she knew that. She needed others to join her in this fight, people who were willing to stand up and fight for justice, for equality, for the future of their children. And she needed to inspire them to believe that change was possible, that they had the power to bring about a cultural shift, to demand inclusion, diversity, and empathy from those who had always ignored them. Her first call to action came when a local activist group, led by a passionate woman named Carla, reached out to her. They had heard about Mia's confrontation with the two men at the diner, and were inspired by her courage. Carla and her group had been organizing protests for months, but they were frustrated by the lack of real change. They needed someone like Mia, someone who could help them mobilize the community and take their efforts to the next level. Mia was hesitant at first. She didn't know Carla or her group well, and she wasn't sure how much influence she could wield. But after a long conversation with Carla, Mia understood that this wasn't about her, it was about all of them, working together to dismantle the systems that kept them oppressed. It wasn't about her being the face of the movement, it was about using the strength of the community to push for real change. With Carla's group behind her, Mia began to take a more active role in the protests. At first, it was small steps. She spoke at rallies, sharing her story and encouraging others to join the cause. She used her powers to protect those who were vulnerable, using her connection with the spirits to shield protesters from harm when the police grew violent. She knew that her presence alone could inspire hope, but she also understood that she needed to do more than just stand as a symbol. She had to take bold action. One night, the group organized a march to the city hall. Mia knew that this would be the most significant action they had taken so far. If they could disrupt the operations of those in power, make their voices heard, they could create real change. The march was peaceful, but Mia's presence radiated power. The spirits of her ancestors whispered encouragement, urging her to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for justice. As they approached City Hall, the police showed up in full force. The tension in the air was palpable, but Mia wasn't afraid. She stood at the front of the group, her stance firm and unwavering. Her ancestors surrounded her, their energy flowing through her, giving her the strength to face whatever came next. The police officers demanded that the protesters disperse, but Mia stepped forward, her voice commanding attention. "We're not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We are demanding accountability. We are demanding equality." The officer in charge, a man with a hard, cold gaze, sneered at her. "You think your little protest is going to change anything? You think we'll just let you take over?" Mia's eyes narrowed. She didn't flinch. "You can try to silence us, but you'll fail. This is only the beginning." As she spoke, she felt a surge of energy from her ancestors. It was as though the spirits were with her, amplifying her voice. She could feel the anger and frustration of the people behind her, their voices joining hers, becoming a collective roar. The officer's face grew pale, and for a moment, he hesitated. But then, his hand shot up, signaling his officers to advance. The line of police officers began to move toward the crowd, their batons raised. Mia could hear the whispers of her ancestors grow louder, urging her to act. Without warning, she raised her arms, and the spirits of her ancestors surged forward. A gust of wind swept through the crowd, and the energy of the people seemed to magnify, rippling outward like a shockwave. The police officers faltered, their faces filled with confusion and fear. The power of Mia's ancestors was unlike anything they had ever encountered. But Mia wasn't finished. "This is our city," she shouted, her voice ringing out above the chaos. "This is our fight. We will no longer be silenced." With those words, the police backed off, retreating in the face of Mia's power and the determination of the people around her. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a chorus of triumph. For the first time in a long time, they felt seen, heard, and respected. The march continued to City Hall, and as they reached the doors, Mia felt a sense of victory wash over her. But she knew this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. There were more battles to be fought, more systems to dismantle. But in that moment, Mia understood the true power of her ancestors, the power of unity, of resilience, of leadership. Together, they would create a cultural shift, one that would inspire future generations to continue the fight for equality, diversity, and inclusion. As the crowd dispersed, Mia stood in front of City Hall, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She had taken the first step toward real change, but the journey ahead would be long. She wasn't afraid. She knew that with the support of her community, with the strength of her ancestors at her back, she could face anything. Together, they would change the world. The days following the successful protest were filled with a sense of uneasy anticipation. The victory was undeniable. Mia had helped lead a movement that had not only disrupted the status quo but had also captured the attention of those in power. Yet, as the days passed, it became clear that the road to lasting change was fraught with challenges. Mia's influence had grown, but so had the opposition. There were whispers of discontent, of powerful figures who were nervous about the momentum the movement was gaining. The media began to paint Mia as a threat, sensationalizing her powers and inflating her influence to create fear. But Mia knew better than to get caught up in their narrative. She had to remain focused on the mission. The work was grueling. Every day, Mia faced opposition, not just from those who opposed the movement but from within the movement itself. There were differences in strategy, in tactics, in what the ultimate goal should be. Some wanted a complete overhaul of the system, while others hoped for more gradual reform. Mia felt the pressure of these competing ideologies, but she understood that unity was crucial. The goal was not to fight among themselves, it was to fight for a common cause. One evening, as Mia sat with Carla and other leaders of the movement, the conversation turned to the next phase of their strategy. They had made progress, but there was still so much to be done. Carla, as passionate as ever, spoke first. "We've stirred the pot. Now we need to push them harder. We need to hit them where it hurts: finances, businesses, politics." Mia listened carefully. She knew that this kind of strategy could escalate tensions, but it was also a path toward real change. Carla's ideas were bold, but they weren't without risk. The police were already on high alert, and the media had begun to scrutinize their every move. Still, Mia couldn't deny the urgency of their cause. "We need to make it clear that we won't stop," Mia finally said. Her voice was steady, but there was a determination behind it that silenced the room. "We've made them uncomfortable. Now we need to make them listen." There was a pause as everyone considered her words. Then Carla nodded. "You're right. It's time to turn up the heat." The next few weeks were intense. The movement escalated quickly, with protests and sit-ins targeting businesses that had long been complicit in maintaining the structures of power. It wasn't always easy to keep everyone united, but Mia's leadership proved crucial. She was the glue that held the movement together, always reminding them of their shared goal: a world of equality, inclusion, and justice. However, it wasn't just the external battles that tested Mia. As the pressure mounted, she began to feel the weight of the spirits more intensely. They had been her source of strength, but now, their presence was overwhelming. Sometimes, it felt as though they were pulling at her from every direction, each ancestor demanding her attention, each voice growing louder until they drowned out her own thoughts. Mia struggled to maintain her balance. She knew she needed the guidance of her ancestors, but their constant presence was beginning to wear on her. It was no longer just about using their power to protect herself or her community. It had become about appeasing them, about managing their expectations. She feared that if she couldn't control the voices, they would consume her. In moments of quiet, when she was alone, Mia found herself retreating inwardly, seeking peace amidst the chaos. She meditated, hoping to find some semblance of clarity, but often, the spirit's whispers only grew more insistent. "You are the chosen one," they would say, their voices blending together in an unrelenting chorus. "You must lead, you must fight. This is your destiny." But Mia wasn't sure if it was her destiny or if it was simply the burden of being thrust into a role she hadn't asked for. She wasn't sure if the spirits had chosen her, or if the world had chosen her, because of the power within her. It was a question that gnawed at her, even in her most peaceful moments. She had been a simple woman before all of this, a woman with a family, a life. Now she was a symbol, a leader, a force to be reckoned with. And with that came responsibilities she had never imagined. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been oppressed, everyone who had ever been silenced. She was fighting for a future where people like her could walk through the world without fear. But Mia had no illusions about how difficult the path ahead would be. The forces that opposed her were not just individuals. They were systems, institutions, ideologies that had been built up over centuries. And dismantling them wouldn't happen overnight. She knew that. She knew that the resistance they faced would only grow stronger the closer they came to real change. But still, she moved forward. She had to. One evening, as Mia stood before a gathering of protesters, a voice broke through the crowd. It was a man, one of the more radical voices within their movement. "We need to be more aggressive. We need to show them that we won't back down. We need to tear down everything." Mia met his gaze. She understood his anger, his frustration. She shared it. But she also understood the importance of strategy. "We don't need to destroy everything," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to transform it. We need to build something new, something just." There was a moment of silence. Then, one by one, the crowd began to nod in agreement. Mia's words had grounded them. They didn't need to tear the world apart, they needed to build something better. The next day, Mia and the leadership group gathered once again to discuss their plan. This time, there was a new sense of clarity. They would continue the protests, but they would also begin working with allies in the political and business sectors. They would find ways to engage with those in power and show them that the movement wasn't just about anger, it was about progress. It was about creating a better world for everyone. Mia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of her ancestors' voices still lingered, but now, they felt like a source of strength, not a burden. She knew that the fight ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. The road to true equality would be long, but Mia had learned one thing: the strength of her people, the resilience of the community, and the power of her ancestors would carry them through. And together, they would see the change they had fought for. Mia's resolve was tested every day. She stood at the forefront of a movement that had taken on a life of its own, but with that came consequences, more personal than she had expected. The pressure of being both a leader and a symbol weighed heavily on her shoulders. As much as she relied on her connection to her ancestors, she could feel herself at a breaking point. The demands of the protest, the continual scrutiny of the media, and the ever-growing distance from her past life were taking their toll. One evening, Mia found herself in a quiet corner of the movement's headquarters, the familiar hum of city life outside a stark contrast to the heavy silence that enveloped her. She had been on the phone with Carla, discussing the logistics for an upcoming rally, but her mind was elsewhere. The spirits, once a source of strength, now felt like an overwhelming presence. Their whispers had become more insistent, their voices more demanding. "You cannot fail," they chanted. "You must lead." But Mia wasn't sure if she could continue. There was a limit to her endurance. She had given everything, her time, her energy, her very soul, to this cause, but as the movement grew, the personal cost grew alongside it. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept soundly, or the last time she had spoken to her family without the weight of responsibility looming over every conversation. The world outside her bubble of activism was slipping further away, and Mia didn't know how to get back to it. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Carla, *, the rally's tomorrow. Be ready. We need you to speak, *. Mia stared at the message, her stomach twisting. She had spoken at countless rallies, always with conviction, always with clarity. But now, doubt clouded her mind. Would she be able to deliver the speech they needed? Would she be able to inspire the same kind of hope that had sparked this movement in the first place? She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The faces of the people who had joined her in the protests flashed in front of her, each one a reflection of the struggle, of the pain that had been passed down through generations. They had believed in her. They had put their trust in her to lead them toward change. But Mia wasn't sure if she had the strength to carry them anymore. The ghosts of her ancestors hovered close, their presence undeniable. They had been with her since the beginning, guiding her, empowering her. But now, instead of comforting her, they felt like shadows, their expectations a crushing weight on her chest. She closed her eyes, seeking a moment of peace. "What do I do?" she whispered into the silence. Their response was immediate, their voices ringing through her mind like a chorus. "Lead," they said. "Fight. You were chosen for this. You cannot abandon your purpose." But Mia wasn't sure if it was her ancestors speaking or if it was the relentless pressure of the world around her that had warped her sense of purpose. She had always wanted to make a difference, to fight for what was right, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The movement had become more than just a protest, it had become a war. The opposition had escalated their tactics, with police brutality intensifying, media smear campaigns growing louder, and businesses that had once been allies now pulling away in fear of the fallout. Mia stood up abruptly, pacing the room. The walls felt as though they were closing in on her, the air thick with tension. She thought of the communities they were fighting for, the young children, the elders, the families whose lives had been disrupted by injustice. They needed her to be strong. They needed her to be unyielding. But Mia was unsure if she could live up to their expectations. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Carla entered, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Mia," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Are you okay?" Mia paused for a moment, torn between admitting her vulnerabilities and pushing through. She forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice betraying her. "Just a lot on my mind." Carla studied her for a long moment before sitting down beside her. "Mia, you don't have to carry this alone. I see what's happening, you're burning out. We all are. But we can't keep going like this." Mia's eyes softened, and she let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know if I can keep going, Carla. This movement, it's bigger than me. And I'm not sure I'm the right person to lead it anymore." Carla shook her head. "You are the right person. You've been leading us from the start. The spirits chose you because of your strength, because of your heart. But strength doesn't mean doing everything on your own. You have to lean on the people around you." Mia felt her throat tighten. "I'm afraid that if I let go, everything will fall apart." Carla placed a hand on Mia's shoulder. "Mia, you're not alone. You have us. We'll carry this with you. You don't have to do it all by yourself." Mia closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She had spent so long shouldering the weight of the movement that she had forgotten what it meant to be part of a community. She had forgotten that leadership wasn't just about making decisions, it was about listening, about sharing the burden. And in that moment, Mia realized that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. The strength of the people around her was just as powerful as the voices of her ancestors. Carla's words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge. Mia looked up at her, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're not alone," Carla repeated, her voice full of conviction. The following day, as the rally began, Mia felt a shift within herself. The crowd was energized, their voices loud with the call for justice. But as Mia stepped up to the podium, she no longer felt the weight of the world bearing down on her. Instead, she felt the strength of the community, the power of unity, and the guiding force of her ancestors at her back. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but it was also filled with a new sense of purpose. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that they were in this together. And with that realization came the strength to keep going, to fight for what was right, not as an individual, but as part of a collective force that could never be broken. The rally was a turning point. The movement had been revitalized, and Mia had rediscovered the power of community. She wasn't alone in this fight. And as long as they stood together, there was no limit to what they could achieve. Mia's resolve deepened as the movement gained momentum, but with that came the growing threat of those who sought to suppress it. The backlash against their efforts escalated quickly. What had begun as an organic outpouring of solidarity was now being systematically attacked. The media spun narratives that framed the protests as violent uprisings, misrepresenting the peaceful nature of the movement. Politicians who had once expressed their support now backtracked, fearing the political fallout. The media's distortions fueled fear, and Mia could see the tension in the streets, the crackling uncertainty that seemed to hover over every protest, every march. As the days wore on, Mia found herself at the center of a storm. The spirits that had guided her felt less like protectors and more like relentless reminders of the stakes. Their whispers, once a source of strength, now felt like an inescapable demand. You must not fail. Your ancestors gave you this power. Lead, or watch your people suffer. But Mia felt the pressure of their expectations bearing down on her, and with every new attack, every new smear campaign, a sense of dread grew. She could not afford to falter, yet the weight of leading so many, of carrying the hopes of a whole community, was suffocating. She was the one they turned to for answers, for hope, for strength. But Mia wasn't sure if she had enough left in her to give. Late one evening, while going through yet another barrage of messages from supporters and critics alike, she found herself standing on the balcony, looking out over the city below. The lights of the buildings blurred together, the usual hum of urban life now a distant, disconnected sound. The world felt detached, as if the protests, the pain, the fight were happening in some faraway realm. She had become a symbol, a figurehead, but was that enough? Was it enough to keep the movement alive? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Carla appeared, standing quietly at her side. Mia had leaned on her more than she cared to admit, but she was grateful for the support. Carla had been there from the very beginning, and while the rest of the world had become hostile, Carla had remained steadfast. "You okay?" Carla asked, her voice soft but carrying a note of concern. Mia nodded slowly, though she didn't feel okay. I don't know, Carla. Everything's falling apart. The media is turning people against us. They're calling us violent rioters. Everything we've worked for is being distorted. How do we fight back against that? How do we make them see the truth?" Carla stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Mia's shoulder. "We fight by staying true to who we are. The truth will always find its way out. They can try to silence us, but they can't erase the reality. The change we're fighting for isn't just about these protests. It's about changing hearts and minds. That takes time, but it will happen." Mia took a deep breath, allowing Carla's words to settle in her mind. She wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that the movement would ultimately prevail, but the doubt was still there, gnawing at her. "How can we keep fighting when everything is stacked against us?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carla smiled, her expression full of quiet strength. "We fight by standing together. We fight by leading with the truth, even when it's hard. Look at what we've already done. We've sparked a cultural shift. People are listening now more than they ever have. And it's because we're not backing down. You're not backing down." Mia looked down at the city below, her thoughts swirling. Her ancestors had fought for their survival, had fought to build a better future for their descendants. She had been given their strength, their courage, and their resilience, but now, she realized, the fight wasn't just about resistance. It was about transformation. The spirits of her ancestors had always urged her to lead, but they had never spoken of what came after the battle, what happened when the world seemed to turn its back on the cause. But now, Mia understood. Change wasn't a one-time victory. It was a process that took time, patience, and relentless persistence. "You're right," Mia said, her voice steadier now. "We can't stop. We can't let them win. But it's not just about fighting the opposition. It's about healing, too. We're not just challenging the system, we're changing it, from the inside out. We're showing people a better way." Carla nodded, her expression proud. "Exactly. And you've already made a difference. You're already a symbol of that change. That's why they're scared." Mia turned to face her, a renewed sense of purpose flooding through her. "Then we can't stop now. I can't stop now." "No, you can't," Carla agreed with a smile. "But you don't have to do it alone." Together, they stood there for a while, the weight of the fight settling in their shared silence. Mia's mind was clearer now, the fog of doubt lifting. She understood, in that moment, that the struggle wasn't over, it had only just begun. And though it would be hard, though it would take time and sacrifice, she was ready to continue. They were all ready. As the rally days continued, Mia's leadership grew stronger. The movement began to shift, not only in the streets, where the voices of the people grew louder and more unified, but also in the hearts of those who had once turned a blind eye to the injustices of the past. Change, though slow, was happening. There were victories in the small moments. The people who had once stood against them now stood beside them. The powerful, once untouchable, were now questioning their own roles and maintaining the systems of oppression. Mia knew that the fight wasn't over, that there was still much to be done. But for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the movement shared, and she no longer carried it alone. The people were with her. The spirits were with her. And together, they would bring about the change that had long been needed. With every passing day, Mia's confidence grew. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: this was her legacy. And she would see it through to the end. The movement had reached a critical point. The nation's attention was now fully focused on the cause, but with that spotlight came the harsh reality of what it took to sustain it. Mia felt the weight of the world bearing down on her, the expectations from every corner of society, from her ancestors' spirits to the streets full of protesters who looked to her for guidance. She was no longer just the face of the movement, she was its beating heart. But that came at a cost. As the stakes grew higher, the pressure began to show. There were moments when Mia questioned if it was all worth it. The constant barrage of media attacks, the betrayal by allies who had once stood by her side, each one left a mark. But Mia was determined not to let those forces break her resolve. She had come too far, and the spirits of her ancestors were with her, urging her forward. The transformation had begun to take shape. More than just a protest, this was a cultural shift, one that went beyond the streets and into people's hearts and minds. More individuals were opening their eyes to the deep-rooted prejudice and systemic injustice that had plagued society for centuries. What Mia and the movement were doing was beginning to ripple outward, pushing people to reconsider their preconceived notions about race, power, and privilege. This was bigger than any single moment, and that realization gave Mia the strength to continue. Still, there were moments of vulnerability. She couldn't help but feel the weight of being the sole figurehead for an entire generation of people seeking justice. In the quietest of moments, when the protests died down and the world seemed to move on, Mia would sit with the ghosts of her ancestors. Their spirits had become a constant presence, guiding her, protecting her, but also pushing her to act. They were her legacy, and she felt their presence stronger than ever as they guided her in ways she hadn't fully understood before. One evening, after a particularly brutal protest that had been violently quelled by law enforcement, Mia sat alone in her apartment, the weight of everything on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some of support, others filled with threats and insults. She could feel the anger of the opposition closing in on her. The violence and the resistance were intensifying. She thought back to her first encounter with the spirit of her grandmother, to the moment when the curse had been awakened. At the time, Mia had been frightened by the powers she had unlocked. Now, she embraced them. It was then that Mia realized something that had eluded her for so long. The strength she had was not just from the spirits of her ancestors. It was from the people, the communities she had built. They were her true power. They were the ones who had turned out in the streets, the ones who had put themselves on the line for a better world. They were the ones who fought not just for themselves, but for every future generation. Mia knew that to carry on, she had to lead them, not just through words, but through action. The transformation they had sparked could not be undone. She had made a promise to herself, and to her ancestors, to stand firm. She would continue to fight, not with violence, but with the strength of her people. Together, they could not be broken. The next few weeks were critical. The opposition was relentless, throwing every obstacle they could at the movement. But Mia, empowered by the support around her, refused to back down. The spirits of her ancestors, once a haunting presence, had become her allies. They whispered words of encouragement, pushing her to hold the line. They reminded her that the fight for justice was not easy, but it was necessary. It was a fight that would shape the future for generations to come. In the final moments of her journey, when the movement had reached its peak, Mia stood before a crowd that had grown into the thousands. The voices of her people had been heard. They had not only sparked a shift in the culture but had begun to challenge the very systems of power that had oppressed them for so long. Mia knew that their work wasn't done, but the battle for justice had begun to tip in their favor. The press, which had once framed the movement as violent and destructive, had begun to shift its narrative. Stories of resilience, of peaceful protests that had defied the violence of the opposition, were now being told. Mia's leadership had inspired a new generation of activists who would continue the work. She had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who believed in the power of unity, equality, and justice. Her legacy, the legacy of those who came before her, had finally taken root. As the movement moved forward, Mia understood that it would never truly be over. The fight for equality was ongoing. But for the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had fulfilled her purpose. She had honored her ancestors and fought not just for justice, but for transformation. Mia had led her people through one of the darkest times, and now, together, they had sparked the light of a new day.